I bet little did you know that all these months the encouragement Moscow is not warring with the Ukrainian armed forces, but precisely with the collective West. Despite the fact that the advance to Brussels stopped on the Lysychansk-Bakhmut highway, it still doesn't interfere with an image of NATO as an enemy in this war, which Russian propagandists create. Greetings, you're on Real Politics, and today we're going to discuss whether Western countries are aware of the dangers connected with Kremlin and which strategies they've applied in this conflict. Starting from the 90s, after the dissolution of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact, Central European countries practically became neutral and out of the defense framework. Let's take a look at this situation through a lens of pragmatism. For Kremlin, for the losing side, the best way out would be to maintain the status quo in relation to these states, because having a weakened economy meant not being able to compete equally with the West for influence in Europe. However, Moscow's wishes did not come true. The states of Europe began to rapidly join NATO. There is an opinion that in this way NATO violated the normal agreement with the Soviet elites about not expanding the West. Firstly, the collapse of the USSR was not a gesture of goodwill, as current Russian government is trying to present. Rather was it a complete defeat of the Soviet system. And secondly, even if this is the case, NATO did not occupy these countries by the right of the winner. On the contrary, these states voluntarily joined the bloc. Many held a referendum on support for a course of accession to NATO. Well, to what extent could the USSR, especially Russia, limit these countries in their politics? The Kremlin often likes to repeat the mantra that one's own security cannot be strengthened at the expense of others. The concepts of security boundaries are very vague in the mouth of Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. The sphere of Russian security, of course, may end with the banks of Rhine, but the sovereignty of the states, the right to rule, is outlined by their borders. If the citizens of Hungary voted for NATO in the referendum, then what right does the Kremlin have to make claims? Where is the solution to their own security issues at the expense of others? And the second nuance, funnily enough, but the most active supporters of NATO expansions are just former members of the Warsaw Pact. I wonder why. In addition to strengthening Europe as its ally, the United States throughout the 1990s helped to carry out democratic and economic transformations of Russia. Certainly not out of altruism. We dare to assume that the idea was to prevent the emergence of a serious geopolitical player that would threaten their interest in future. As Sun Tzu said, the greatest victory is that which requires no battle. If the Western plan succeeded, a democratic Russia would share Western values and become a part of Europe, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. At the same time, the Russian-Ukrainian war primarily depletes the potential of these countries and puts an end to Russia's future opportunities to consolidate leadership in the region. Plus, do not forget that the rally around the flag effect works not only within Russia, but also among Western countries. So Russia doomed itself to a war that does not allow the country to develop and which she cannot win. Many, including University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer, blame NATO for provoking this war, but is he right? Let's look at this issue in more details. NATO is not a threat to the Russian Federation. In past videos, we have already explained why the invasion of democracy in Russia is unlikely. Today, we'll consider one more nuance. Once Putin said that if Ukraine joins NATO, then the flight time of missiles to Moscow will be reduced to 7 minutes. Yes, but the flight time from the Baltic countries, which also border Russia, is already within a couple of minutes to the second largest city of St. Petersburg. So, okay, let's go along with the Russian propagandists and imagine that in order to raise his rating before the election, Joe Biden decided to appreciate NATO to launch a coordinated attack on Russia. Well, of course it was just a joke. But the first target of the Western countries would certainly be the places of deployment of Russian nuclear warheads, because it's rational and pragmatic. Large stockpiles of nuclear weapons are just located on the Svalbard Peninsula, which borders Finland, a country that has recently joined NATO. Surely, Russia has already assembled a second strike force near the borders of Northern Europe to prevent a possible threat, right?
Nope.
Russia itself called NATO its enemy and did it solely in its own interests. The story of the expansion of the West fits perfectly with the rationale for unleashing an aggressive war, creating the illusion that the Kremlin was deprived of a choice. Let's take a look at Russia's demands for NATO proposed during the negotiations on security guarantees that took place in the winter of 2022. First, to rule out further NATO expansion. And the second one, NATO countries must refrain from conducting any military activity on the territory of Ukraine as well as on the territory of other states of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. You know, it's a pity they didn't specify whether the US could keep Alaska. I think there would have been a serious discussion in the State Department on this issue. Judging by the tone of these negotiations, Russia considers itself, if not the top one in terms of military power, then equal to all the members of the alliance put together. I wonder why NATO rejected the constructive proposal of the Kremlin. Even if there was no NATO, the Kremlin would come up with 1,001 reasons why it is necessary to attack Ukraine. Russia has put the West in a better position than it was. It buried its prospects and got bogged down in the war. At the same time, neither the US nor the European Union is a direct player in this conflict. Let's take a look at what the West can pursue in this war. It is important for each country to maximize its successes and minimize its risks. On one hand, the West is helping Ukraine enough to keep Russia from winning, but also not to get involved. So developing this point of view, the best option would be for Ukraine to win with the least amount of arms supplied and the risks taken. The worst is the defeat of Ukraine with the largest supply of the weapons. Consequently, Western countries are trying to act accordingly to the situation, either increasing the supply of Ukraine or reducing it. At the same time, public pressure should not be underestimated. The atrocities in Bucha and Kramatorsk have certainly strengthened democratic leaders' support for Ukraine. Ironically, the idea of a war with NATO was a message to be sold exclusively in the domestic market. Thus, Russia has put itself on a par with China and the United States. The authorities sold the greatness of their foreign policy without incurring losses. For many years, Cold War doctrine has served the Kremlin well, with no consequences following it. But the idea becomes an action. In international relations, it is much more profitable to threaten by force than to use it on the battlefield. The Russian authorities realized this by their own example. It is not division numbers on a blank maps that are fighting, but the real people with their motivation, goals, and fears.